Fancy girls was a term used by slave traders to describe young, attractive, light-skinned female slaves who were in their custody. Fancy girls were typically teenagers, but could be children as young as 8 years old. Like most slaves, these female slaves were usually illiterate. Slave traders used rape and other forms of sexual and physical violence to manipulate them. Fancy girls were likely to end up as prostitutes or concubines. Today, what slave traders did to fancy girls is called sex trafficking. Sex trafficking is illegal. However, in the early 1800s, Southern laws offered fancy girls no protection whatsoever. Fancy girls were usually the product of their mothers being raped by slave owners' family members or friends, or overseers. In the South, the child of an enslaved woman was a slave for life. Southern states adopted the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, which states that any child born takes the status of the mother. Children born to enslaved mothers were the property of slave owners. Slave owners could keep enslaved mothers' children or sell the children to slave traders. Fancy girls were young, light-skinned female slaves who were sold by slave owners to slave traders. Slave traders were speculators, buying slaves at a low price and selling them at a higher price. During the process of slave trading, slave traders permanently separated slave family members, husbands from wives, mothers from children, and siblings. The fancy girl trade was a lucrative segment of the domestic slave trade. Slave traders sought young, light-skinned female slaves. Light-skinned female slaves with white features such as white skin, blonde hair, or blue eyes were very valuable. The domestic slave trade involved in the migration of approximately 1 million slaves from the tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake Bay region to cotton plantations in the Deep South between 1808 and 1865. When the United States banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808, the price of domestically bred slaves soared, particularly in the Deep South, due to the expansion of cotton production, which required slave labor. The expansion of cotton production made the United States a global economic leader. In the 1830s, the United States was the world's leading cotton exporter. Cotton grown in the South was a key component of Britain's Industrial Revolution. The production of cotton depended on unpaid slave labor. Therefore, as the price of cotton soared, so did the price of slaves in the Deep South's cotton-growing regions. As a result, slaves could be purchased in the Chesapeake Bay region for less than $400 and sold in New Orleans for $1,200 or more. Slave traders like Franklin and Armfield purchased young, light-skinned female slaves from planters in Virginia and Maryland and sold them at slave auctions in New Orleans. While in their custody, slave traders were known to repeatedly rape these young women and physically abuse them. In the South, raping an enslaved woman was not a crime. New Orleans had the largest fancy girl slave market in the nation. The city was one of the wealthiest cities in the country due to the slave trade and the cotton export business. In New Orleans, there were slave auctions that took place in luxury hotels, such as the Rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel. These slave auctions were formal social events that were attended by the affluent who dressed in formal attire. At these slave auctions, slave traders dressed fancy girls in attractive attire. The women were coiffed and had on jewelry. Slave traders, seeking to maximize their profits, instructed fancy girls on how to carry themselves on stage to attract potential buyers. For the wealthy, buying and selling slaves at a slave auction boosted their social status. White men were generally sexually attracted to light-skinned female slaves who carried themselves and behaved as if they were white women. Fancy girls were sold for the explicit purpose of sexual exploitation. White men could rape a fancy girl at will. In contrast, raping a white woman was a crime. Owning light-skinned female slaves allowed white men to fulfill their exotic sexual fantasies. In Louisiana, enslaved women were not allowed to marry white men. White men were not responsible for any children they might have fathered with enslaved women. However, the children of enslaved women were the property of white owners. White owners could keep their mixed-race children or sell them to slave traders. White men could keep fancy girls around as long as it pleased their fancy, thus the term fancy girl. Fancy girls were most likely to become prostitutes or concubines. At slave auctions, fancy girls usually sold for 4 or 5 times as much as a female field laborer. Fancy girls could sell for as much or more than a prime male field laborer. Owning fancy girls was a status symbol for wealthy men. Compared to a field slave, a fancy girl had a privileged life. Nonetheless, a fancy girl was not free. She was still a slave and the property of her owner. In January 1857, James White, a New Orleans slave trader, purchased Alexina Morrison as a fancy girl at the slave market in New Orleans. Morrison was 15 years old at the time she was purchased by White. She had white skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair and appeared to be white. Morrison managed to run away from White. In October 1857, Morrison filed a freedom suit in Louisiana's 3rd District Court. In Morrison v. White, Morrison petitioned the court to declare her legally free and White and added a request that the court award her $10,000 damages for the wrong that White had done to her by holding her as a slave. She based her case on the claim that her real name was Alexina, not Jane, that she was from Arkansas, and that she had been born free and of white parentage, or, as she put it in a later affidavit, that she is of white blood and free and entitled to her freedom, and that on view this is manifest. Essentially, Alexina Morrison claimed that she was white because she looked that way. The question before the court was, despite appearing to be white, was Morrison indeed white? Before it was settled, that suit would be considered by 3 different juries and be put before the Louisiana Supreme Court twice. Courts across the South made determinations about who was white and who was black. Louisiana courts used a so-called scientific approach that estimated the amount of black blood a person possessed. Terms like halves, fourths, eighths, and sixteenths were used to describe the amount of black blood a person possessed. There was a general assumption that the presence of black blood caused detectable differences in physical appearance and behavior of a person who appeared to be white that distinguished them from a person who was actually white. Some claimed that blackness could be detected by curls in the hair, the whiteness of the eyes, and the shape of the nose and lips. Others claimed that the presence of black blood was apparent in a black person's countenance, conversation, or carriage. Witnesses testified that Morrison appeared to be white, but they could not be sure. The witnesses included medical professionals who physically examined Morrison. In the end, however, there was little to convince observers or jurors that the plaintiff sitting before them was anything but white because she looked and acted as people expected whites to do.